Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand.
For centuries, virtually every major thinker, from Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle all the way through the medieval church fathers, Augustine, Aquinas,
Right.
they all settled on a kind of foundational consensus.
Right.
They believed the highest goal of the state, the one thing it should strive for above all others, was peace.
Peace, justice, and the good life. That was sort of the political trinity, right?
Exactly.
But today we are diving deep into the mind of a man who looked at 2,000 years of that intellectual tradition and then looked at the actual state of human affairs and concluded that the entire consensus was not just wrong, but dangerously wrong.
We are talking about Niccolò Machiavelli.
And this deep dive is all about the central, provocative idea that really fuels his entire philosophy. It's this massive intellectual inversion.
It is. Machiavelli fundamentally argues that instead of peace being naturally superior to war, it's actually war that asserts a primacy over peace.
That's the intellectual bomb at the heart of his work. And the mission for you, the listener, today is to get a quick but really profound understanding of his whole intellectual enterprise. I mean, he wasn't just offering survival tips for princes.
Not at all. He was trying to free humankind from these traditional, debilitating dogmas, religious, moral, political, which in his view had just blinded people to the true effective conditions required for human excellence and, well, for political stability.
And we're going to be dissecting this argument using specific excerpts from his core texts, The Prince, Discourses on Livy, Art of War, and his Florentine histories. We're really focusing on his writings about military necessity and the deeper philosophical motivation behind it. The drama here, the existential itch he was scratching, was that he just observed human life constantly failing to achieve any kind of lasting security. Why did Florence keep getting humiliated? Why did Italy remain so weak?
And his answer was that political leaders were guided by these comfortable delusions, the dogma of peace and morality instead of the harsh, effective truth of necessary force.
So the villain of the piece, then, is that previous tradition itself.
It has to be. The tradition that argued peace was, divinely or naturally superior to war. Machiavelli saw this view as the primary source of political weakness because it constrained human action. It incentivized leaders to just outsource the hardest problem defense to other people.
And the high stakes couldn't be clearer for you today. If we ignore this radical focus on military necessity, we lose the means to create any stable political order in what is fundamentally a hostile world.
He states it so explicitly. He basically redefines the entire political purpose of the state in purely military terms.
Right.
He argues that good military orders are perhaps the necessary and sufficient condition of good political orders. Or at the very least, he posits that political orders exist for the sake of the military orders.
That is a profound reversal. The classical tradition argued we form a state to achieve justice or the good life.
And Machiavelli says no. You form a state and you institute a political order so you can raise and sustain a reliable fighting force. And that force then allows you to survive and maybe create some temporary peace.
It totally redefines the purpose of government. The most important department isn't the treasury or justice, it's the Department of War.
Yes. We really cannot understand his political vision without accepting that he viewed ordering a state primarily as a bellicose exercise. It's a way of ordering citizens for constant struggle.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Machiavelli's philosophy isn't born in some ivory tower. It's forged in the smoke and mud of political humiliation.
Absolutely. When he presents his knowledge, he insists it comes from two necessary conditions: long experience with modern things and continuous reading of ancient ones.
And he explicitly tells the reader, right, that one alone is insufficient.
Completely insufficient. And that long experience was, well, it was intense, it was practical, and it was deeply personal for him. He was not an armchair theorist.
No. For 14 years, he served as Florence's head of military administration and its top diplomatic official. And this was during years of almost continuous war.
He was literally the Secretary of War. Few political philosophers were ever so deeply immersed in the practical conduct of their topic before writing a single word about it. He negotiated treaties, he interviewed mercenary captains, he managed supply lines.
And you see this context, this raw, humiliating context laid bare in his decennials and Florentine histories. He paints this picture of Florence's pitiable military state, which, it really highlights the weakness of the unarmed heart of these Italian city-states.
They were wealthy cultural centers, but they had utterly outsourced their own existence.
And the constant, repetitive, just humiliating failure to reconquer Pisa, which Florence saw as absolutely essential to its own security and prosperity, that became the barometer of the city's strategic fortunes.
It really did. The city was repeatedly at the mercy of its hired forces, the condottieri.
So the common wisdom at the time was that hiring professional soldiers, these mercenaries, was the cheapest and safest option, right? It supposedly kept the citizens free to make money, and it kept military dangers away from the domestic political scene.
Well, that was the comfortable delusion. And Machiavelli witnessed the collapse of this delusion firsthand. A perfect, painful example came in 1500 during the siege of Pisa.
What happened there?
The Gascon troops mutinied, and the Swiss guards under Florentine contract, supposedly the elite forces, they abducted the Florentine commissioner to extort money.
They were holding the city's top official for ransom.
They were. So you hire a massive, expensive army to protect you, and their first act is to turn on you and extort your own government.
Unbelievable.
The city's officials, the entire military operation, were truly at the mercy of the mercenaries. This was the dramatic failure of hired forces.
And why? What was the root cause?
Because the condottieri lacked sufficient cause or love for Florence to actually die for it. Their operational incentive was to prolong the conflict, not to risk their lives in these decisive, annihilating battles. They preferred to keep the war going, to keep the cash flowing.
So it's basically a perverse economic system where failure is profitable and a decisive success is career suicide for the mercenary captain?
Exactly. And if they did succeed, they became too powerful, instantly turning into a political threat to the state that hired them.
And that leads us to the incident with Paolo Vitelli.
Yes, Vitelli was, he was arguably the most highly reputed mercenary captain in Italy at the time. After a long siege, his artillery breached Pisa's walls. But instead of storming the city when the breach was opened, that decisive, high-risk moment, he hesitated.
And what was the consequence of that hesitation?
Florentine outrage was total. Vitelli was arrested and eventually executed. And Machiavelli, who was there, he retrospectively defended that harsh punishment in his diplomatic correspondence.
Even though there was no solid evidence of betrayal?
No, none ever emerged. Machiavelli's defense rested on necessity, the absolute brittleness of Florence's position. He had to be a traitor, or he was just a failure who lacked the courage to win. Either way, his existence as an independent force was just too dangerous for Florence.
So this constant fear of being betrayed by success or ruined by failure, that's what drove his signature achievement.
The founding of Florence's first native fighting force in over a century. He rejected the mercenary system entirely.
He had to.
He had to. He recognized that this practical necessity required a fundamental intellectual shift, which brings us to a crucial concept to decode the logic of military preparedness.
Okay.
The native militia is effectively the reproduction of outside dangers inside the state.
That sounds completely counterintuitive. Why would you deliberately bring a danger inside?
Because Machiavelli's uncomfortable logic dictates that bringing that military danger inside in the form of your own armed citizens is prudent only because the external danger, an uncontested, powerful foreign force, can be controlled less effectively.
So a native force is dangerous internally?
Oh, yes. It requires continuous management, austerity, discipline, but it is ultimately controllable by the state's authorities, and it's politically aligned with the city's survival.
And this native militia was instrumental in the greatest success of his career, wasn't it? The reconquest of Pisa in 1509.
It was the summit of his military success. And it wasn't achieved through some dramatic cinematic battle.
No.
No, it was achieved through the patient, unglamorous management of a native force of more than 3,000 men, employing a strategy focused on total devastation of the surrounding countryside and interdiction. It proved that a dedicated native force, rooted in political will, could achieve victory through sustained effort.
Even if it lacked the technical flash of the condottieri.
Exactly. And Machiavelli contrasts this austere, dedicated Italian arms, or lack thereof, with the strength of European powers like France and Spain. He saw French strength in heavy cavalry, but he fundamentally understood that strength required a stalwartness rooted in orders and austerity.
As opposed to the Italian predilection for creature comforts.
That phrase, creature comforts, is vital. It's a philosophical critique disguised as a military assessment. The Florentines prioritized domestic peace, luxury, commerce, the good life, over the difficult, arduous, austere effort of self-defense.
And that prioritization, in his view, made them weak and ripe for conquest.
Precisely. And this focus on underlying strength leads him directly into his assessment of other major powers, documented in his portraits of French and German affairs.
This is where he turns political science into a form of geopolitical threat modeling.
Absolutely. He shifts focus entirely from the individual military virtue of a captain, which had been the obsession of writers before him, to the underlying conditions that produce effective armies. He looks at geography, socioeconomic factors, and crucially, constitutional institutions and practices.
So his conclusion isn't get a better general, it's fix your government.
That's it, in a nutshell. His conceptual framework determined that the successive mediation between raw power and effective military action depends on the state's constitutional cohesion. The key criterion is effective centralization of princely power.
Okay.
So France's military vigor was tied directly to its political centralization, the obedience of its barons to the king. Germany, on the other hand, had formidable population, wealth, fierce soldiers, but it failed to translate that strength into effective action.
Because of political disunity?
Political disunity and a lack of strong central authority.
So Art Iron really shows us that his theory is forged in the humiliation of practical military necessity. I mean, the inability to defend Florence forced him to recognize this fundamental, non-negotiable truth. If you do not master the use of force, you are a slave to fortune.
And to anyone who holds a sharper sword, this lived, practical necessity leads directly to the theoretical hierarchy of arms over laws.
Okay, let's unpack this then. If that was the lived experience, the constant shame of being extorted by your own hired muscle, how does he move this from a mere practical problem to a sweeping philosophical theorem? Where does he formalize this idea that arms come first?
He formalizes it in The Prince, chapter 12. This is the engine room of his statecraft, the intellectual axiom that overturns millennia of thought.
So what does he say?
He states that the foundations of all states are good laws and good arms. But then he immediately collapses the complexity with a single devastating line of causality.
Which is?
Because there cannot be good laws where there are not good arms, and where there are good arms there must be good laws. I will leave out the reasoning on laws and speak of arms.
Wow. He literally says, I don't even need to discuss laws because if you have arms, you automatically get laws.
But not the other way around.
Right. If you have laws, you don't automatically get arms.
This is the assertion of priority and causality. Arms are the true foundation of states. Laws are entirely dependent on arms for their existence and enforcement, but arms are fundamentally independent of laws.
Without the military capability to enforce domestic order and defend against external threats, laws are just parchment.
They're quickly overturned by outside force or internal dissent.
So where did Italy go so wrong that it forgot this foundational truth? We see the historical origin of this unarmed, flawed foundation laid bare in the Florentine histories.
He identifies two primary forces responsible for the unarmed condition of Italy: the papacy and the resulting system of mercenary warfare. And this is a damning historical indictment that goes way beyond a simple military critique.
The papacy, as a religious entity, was inherently unarmed.
Precisely. Machiavelli argues that priests, lacking personal knowledge of arms, and often forbidden from even bearing them, were compelled to hire foreigners, the condottieri, to protect their temporal states.
And this created a perverse, self-sustaining system.
It did. A system where mercenary captains and priests became correlative terms, mirror images of one another, the armed and the unarmed.
The armed man needed the priest's cash. The unarmed priest needed the armed man's protection.
And this dynamic, which had been in place for centuries, it just fundamentally undermined the integrity of political powers all across Italy. Every ruler, religious or secular, depended on outsourced force.
Which explains why even the wealthiest Florentine leaders like Cosimo de' Medici were caught in this trap.
Exactly. Cosimo's immense power and influence depended entirely on maintaining a stable cash flow to pay the condottieri. This dependence underlined the precariousness of this type of rule. Rule based on wealth and hired muscle was inherently unstable compared to rule based on one's own arms.
And the reliance on external force just fractured the concept of political unity itself. Which brings us to another crucial concept decoder. Machiavelli defines not one, but two kinds of unity.
Yes. We have to distinguish between chimerical unity and martial unity.
Okay, what's chimerical unity?
Chimerical unity is the moralist's dream. Domestic harmony, the common good, where everyone agrees and is quiet. Machiavelli saw Florence and other Italian city-states constantly striving for this fragile quietness.
And martial unity.
That is standing together against outside forces because of a manifest military necessity. For Machiavelli, this latter unity is the only practical, achievable goal. He contrasts Florence, which prized domestic quietness, with Rome. Rome ordered itself for perpetual war. Rome's internal political life was tumultuous. The Senate and the plebs were constantly fighting, demanding reforms, threatening secession.
Wait, so Machiavelli sees that internal fight, that tumult, as a good thing?
He sees it as a necessary, vigorous engine. Rome successfully channeled that internal friction, that energy, that political heat outward into foreign policy and conquest. The domestic policy became the perfect servant of its foreign policy.
So the constant anticipation and preparation for war kept the cities inside a zone of tumultuous peace for centuries, a functional equilibrium.
Yes, whereas Florence's inside was a perpetual weak battleground, constantly susceptible to outside manipulation.
That's an astounding observation. He's saying that the cause of Roman greatness was not its peace, but its institutionalized conflict.
Exactly. This is why he says, the cause of the disunion of republics is usually idleness and peace. The cause of union is fear and war.
Fear of the external enemy forces citizens who might disagree intensely on domestic issues to stand together.
And idleness and peace, conversely, cause people to turn their competitive and aggressive energies inward, leading to internal fracture and political decay.
So it's fear, not love or abstract morality, that provides the necessary cohesion for the state. This perspective leads Machiavelli to equate having arms of one's own with virtue.
And virtue, in this specific Machiavellian sense, is effectiveness, decisiveness, resilience, and above all, self-reliance. It's the practical capability to succeed.
And the founder who relies on persuasion alone, the unarmed prophet, is the polar opposite of virtue.
The classic example being Savonarola.
Absolutely.
Savonarola was a deeply religious man who seized control of Florence through powerful moral persuasion. He was easily able to persuade people at first, but the nature of the multitude is variable. When challenged by the Pope or when people tired of his strict moral regime, Savonarola lacked the force, the arms, to keep them in that persuasion.
He came to ruin quickly because he had to beg or pray for support, not command it through force.
And the people abandoned him because he couldn't protect them from external threats.
Yeah.
Yes. Arms provide the necessary, firm experience needed to transform that lukewarm, easily overturned belief into true conviction.
So arms enabled the new prince to first hold firm his initial supporters by demonstrating unassailable strength.
And then to succeed in making unbelievers believe, not through spiritual conversion, but through military reality. They believe because the prince can enforce the reality he preaches.
This military focus is so deep it even dictates the internal workings of the fighting force, as detailed in Art of War. You might assume discipline would be rooted in patriotic dedication, but he rejects that idealism entirely.
He does. He argues that discipline relies on two fundamental, reliable human appetites: the fear of death and punishment, and the hope of reward, the spoils of victory. He builds his army on the bedrock of human self-interest, not abstract duty.
So soldiers are fundamentally not fighting for the state. They are fighting for their immediate personal interests.
Exactly. Their love of individual property or profit is no less a ground for making soldiers obstinate than self-preservation itself. The reason Roman soldiers, the model he studies, fought well was partly ideological, yes, but it was mostly pragmatic.
Okay.
They knew their possessions, their pay, the promise of land were all tied directly to the battalion's flag. If they fled, they might save their lives temporarily, but they would lose their possessions and the chance for future wealth.
He brilliantly engineered a system where the soldiers' personal greed and fear were inextricably linked to the collective goal of victory.
It is the ultimate expression of the effectual truth. He works with men as they are, greedy, fearful, and self-interested, not as they ought to be. This reliance on personal interest ensures that the military orders are strong, predictable, and resilient.
Unlike the flimsy loyalty of the condottieri.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Machiavelli isn't just a military strategist, he's a political economist of violence. If arms are the foundation of the state, the prince, who relies on a successful general, a capable winning captain, has just created his own dilemma.
He certainly has.
The more the captain wins, the greater his glory, the more he inevitably becomes a mortal threat to the political authority he serves.
This is the classic security dilemma in a principality. The captain, by nature of his success, acquires a reputation, a reputazione, that rivals the prince's own power. And because the captain cannot avoid threatening the prince by simply becoming too glorious, the prince cannot avoid injustice to the captain by striking at him.
So success creates the conditions for betrayal. either by the prince against the captain or the captain against the prince.
It is an unavoidable structural conflict. The only true solution for the prince is to fundamentally merge the roles. The prince must be the captain himself, going in person and himself perform the office of captain. He must not delegate the foundational activity of the state.
And he uses the historical figure of Agathocles the Sicilian to illustrate the type of man capable of mastering both roles.
Yes, a criminal captain who successfully overthrew the republic that nurtured him, seizing power through sheer brutality.
And Machiavelli initially appears to condemn him, stating he can't be celebrated as an excellent human being despite being an excellent captain.
It sounds like a nod to traditional morality, but it's a rhetorical setup. Machiavelli quickly rehabilitates him. He just chips away at the traditional moral distinction until it collapses, arguing that Agathocles' inhuman cruelty was essential to his success.
Wait a minute. So if the greatest founders, the people who create the stable orders we rely on, are necessarily the greatest captains, and those captains are, by his own logic, compelled to be criminals, how can the resulting state claim any legitimacy or moral authority?
Well, that is the crucial, uncomfortable question Machiavelli forces us to ask.
Isn't he just defining political success down to brute, amoral survival?
He is arguing that the concept of legitimacy and moral authority is entirely secondary to the need for secure political survival. He defines cruelty not by its existence, but by its application. Agathocles used his cruelty well focused on security, eliminating rivals decisively and then stopping the bloodshed. And that resulted in a stable rule for decades.
So, cruelty used effectively for the foundation of a stable state is politically superior to virtue that leads to the state's ruin.
Precisely. Machiavelli argues that if you want to achieve the security everyone craves, the greatest founders must be willing to commit necessary acts of injustice to secure the common good. He is forcing us to accept that the founder, the man of virtue, is often necessarily a criminal in the eyes of traditional morality.
Okay, so if a principality is perpetually haunted by the threat of its own commander, how then does a republic solve this dilemma if it can't have one citizen be the captain forever?
The Republican solution, detailed in the discourses, is to institutionalize ingratitude. A republic has to manage rather than eliminate the ambitions of its great men.
And how did Rome do that?
Rome mitigated the prisoner's dilemma by employing many capable citizens as commanders who guarded one another.
Their mutual fear and desire for glory kept them from individually overthrowing the political authorities. It's a system of checks and balances powered by intense personal ambition.
That's the brilliance of the Roman system. The Republic leveraged ambition against itself. The love of glory functions as a check and a rule on the commander. It pushes him to operate at his peak to gain distinction-winning wars, bringing back spoils, but he must immediately return to private life to avoid the Senate's suspicion.
So Republican government itself, by requiring a captain to dissolve his army and return to being a private citizen after a victory, constitutes necessary ingratitude.
Yes, toward its most outstanding citizens. It's a brutal system, but it's structurally stable. It ensures that no single commander can accrue enough power to move from military hero to political tyrant.
And that leads to the realization that the commander needs far more than just battlefield tactics. They need situational understanding, a knowledge of the world, which is essentially political intelligence.
Machiavelli's writings show that strategy generation is intensely political, not merely tactical. We see this in the Second Punic War.
Right.
The major strategic decisions, like the switch from Fabius Maximus's famous delaying strategy of attrition to Scipio Africanus's aggressive annihilation strategy, those were not purely military calculations. They were highly political, worked out in the Senate, influenced by the commander's ambitions, and fueled by the people's passions.
The people were tired of Fabius's cautious approach.
Exactly. This is the dynamic civil-military relationship in full view. Strategy is a political function.
The commander must be a master manipulator of the political landscape, both inside and outside the army. He needs to dictate not just movement, but morale.
Absolutely. The prudent captain must impose every necessity to fight on his own soldiers, while simultaneously removing that necessity from the enemy. This is the core instruction on necessity from the discourses.
So the most prudent commander is basically a stage manager who burns the bridges behind his own troops while conveniently leaving a perfectly safe escape exit for the enemy.
That's it. It is psychological warfare taken to an extreme. It is the calculated application of human psychology. Machiavelli teaches that necessity is the last and greatest weapon, but it must be imposed not by nature, but by the commander's art and prudence.
By cutting off retreat, you force your soldiers into obstinate, desperate defense.
Linking their survival directly to victory. And by providing the enemy an easy path to flee, you encourage disintegration and cowardice.
This brings us back to the master analogy for the commander's necessary knowledge, the gyroscope.
Yes, a gyroscope provides an artificial horizon that remains fixed, even as the plane rolls and pitches and changes direction. Machiavelli's writings describe the commander's mind functioning exactly like this.
So the commander's mind remains oriented not by being fixed on one stable, moral, true north,
But by being constantly in motion matching, encountering the dizzying gyrations of troops, rivals, allies, enemies, political masters, and the people.
So it's not about finding one moral law and sticking to it. It's about being able to process dozens of shifting, amoral truths simultaneously without suffering internal collapse. It's dynamic moral triage required for survival.
Any lesser knowledge, any lazier thinking rooted in abstract justice or moral goodness leaves them exposed and guarantees disaster. The commander, the practical philosopher, operates in perpetual motion, constantly adjusting to the effectual truth of a chaotic world.
We have to pivot now to the ultimate purpose, the philosophical motivation for this entire restructuring of political thought.
Machiavelli's long-term campaign is to free humankind intellectually from traditional constraints. To achieve this, he had to wage what we might call spiritual warfare against the preceding tradition.
And the sources reveal a fascinating structural element of this spiritual warfare embedded right in the art of war dialogue.
Yes, this is a subtle but profound signal. The entire military section of the art of war is subtly reorganized around fighting a seen enemy on the battlefield and an unseen enemy, the intellectual tradition itself.
How so?
The text describes the ideal army encampment and instructs the commander that it should always face the east, the symbolic home of the Christian God and the biblical religion.
So he is literally instructing his commander to set up the instruments of war to face down the source of spiritual authority that he believes caused Italy's weakness.
It is a war in speech against the preceding tradition, specifically Christianity, which he views as having rendered the world weak and given it in prey to criminal men. His argument isn't theological, it's purely political and sociological.
And this is a direct, open critique of the values Christianity installed in the West. We need the mic drop, quote, context here, the contrast between ancient and modern views of human excellence.
Machiavelli is explicit about the debilitating consequences of this philosophical shift. He draws a harsh line between ancient virtue and modern humility. He says, the ancient religion did not beatify men if they were not full of worldly glory, as were captains of armies and princes of republics. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men.
Let's break down that profound difference in values. What did the ancient world value in a man of action, like a victorious Roman general?
They valued greatness of spirit, strength of body, and all other things capable of making men robust and capable of dominating fortune. The highest honors, triumphs, statues, went to those who were active, who engaged in the brutal necessary work of conquering and ruling.
The reward was tangible worldly glory.
Yes, which was often linked to divinity.
And what did the Christian world value, which Machiavelli sees as the source of political weakness?
By placing the highest good in humility, abjectness, and contempt of things human, the new religion fundamentally changes human aspiration. Machiavelli argues that this focus makes men think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them.
That is the political consequence, a philosophy of endurance over aggression. Weakness invites predation. He's arguing that the traditional moral framework, which tells you to forgive, turn the other cheek, and focus on the next life, is a political suicide pact in this world.
And he argues that placing the highest value in the contemplative life, the life of the monk or the philosopher, removed from the necessary brutality of command, instead of the active life of the statesman and commander, has rendered the world soft, passive, and therefore given it in prey to criminal men who can manage it securely.
If the good men choose contemplation, the bad men inherit the world.
Precisely. And this requires refashioning philosophy itself. Machiavelli replaces the traditional Socratic philosopher, the lover of wisdom who seeks abstract justice, with the military commander as the true philosopher, knower.
That is truly radical. He's saying that actual political understanding and the highest form of wisdom can only be achieved by someone who has blood on their hands.
Or at least who understands the necessary brutality of command. The best knowers are military commanders because they possess the knowledge of the world required to manage military and political necessities.
And this knowledge of the world compels them to dispense with traditional moral precepts when they must.
Absolutely. Machiavelli drives this home by including philosophical sayings, not from Plato, but from his fictionalized warrior prince, Castruccio Castracani. On his deathbed, Castruccio wished to die like Caesar, the man who conquered and ruled through force, not like Socrates, the philosopher who accepted his fate and died by drinking hemlock.
So he's demonstrating that the highest wisdom belongs to the one who can master force and necessity in the real world. So the purpose of his attack wasn't just to be wicked or to promote tyranny, but to provide a radical defense of political freedom and survival by embracing the effectual truth of things.
Exactly. He prepared the intellectual ground for subsequent generations of thinkers to reconquer the world, using rational means directed toward the rational ends of security and glory. He wanted humanity to shift all political action away from moral fantasy and firmly ground it in the necessary brutal realities of this world, where conflict is constant and unavoidable.
So we've traveled from the humiliation of Florence's mercenary system, where commissioners were held for ransom, to the philosophical necessity of war as the true political foundation.
Right. We saw him insist that arms must be the necessary precursor to laws, and that political greatness requires the ruler to master the art of war personally, becoming the captain himself, or institutionalizing ingratitude to manage ambition.
And we discovered that his seemingly brutal instruction serves a higher function, an intellectual campaign to force us to confront the actual, non-negotiable necessities of power. He strips away the comfortable delusion that peace is natural, or that good intentions can substitute for capability.
Let's revisit the master analogy.
Yeah.
If you are a cybersecurity consultant, Machiavelli is forcing you to replace wishful moral fantasy with self-reliant threat modeling. You cannot hire out your core security capability. The condottieri are always looking for a higher bidder. You must internalize the hard knowledge and the force necessary to defend yourself, or you will be exploited. You must possess the virtue.
Machiavelli's work teaches that success in life, whether political or personal, often requires a moral ambush, compelling us to choose our own security and self-preservation over abstract justice when necessity dictates.
If you accept Machiavelli's premise that life is perpetual conflict, then the greatest intellectual danger is not ignorance of philosophy, but the laziness of thinking you can achieve security without accepting the constant brutal necessity of conflict.
That leaves us with a profound, provocative question for you, the learner, to mull over. If Machiavelli argues that constant awareness of war is the foundation for a state's lasting peace and freedom, where in your own life, in your career, your relationships, or your personal security, are you relying on lukewarm defenders or mercenary arms instead of developing the necessary hard knowledge and virtue to protect your own fundamental interests?
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Machiavelli's intellectual warfare.